Rain slicked the asphalt outside the Cobalt Lounge, catching the neon signs in a greasy, fractured glow. Inside, ice clinked against heavy crystal. The city was a machine of moving parts, and Dominic Rossi owned the engine. Nora Hayes was just a waitress trying to make rent, carrying a tray of dirty glasses. She tripped on a frayed rug. Gravity pulled her down. She didn't hit the floor, she hit him. And the machine stopped. The tray weighed roughly 7 pounds. But at 2 in the morning, after an 8-hour shift on 3-inch heels, it felt like a slab of concrete. Nora's feet were numb. That was the only mercy the Cobalt Lounge offered its staff. The high-end club catered to the city's elite, which meant a dress code of sheer black fabric and smiles that had to look genuine even when a Wall Street broker slapped your hip. Nora kept her head down. She balanced the tray of half-empty whiskey tumblers and crumpled napkins on her palm, navigating the labyrinth of velvet booths. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars, spilled bourbon, and desperation dressed up as luxury. Booth 4 was the dead zone. The staff knew it. The manager, a sweaty, nervous man named Sullivan, had warned them before the shift. Nobody goes near Booth 4 unless called, and if you are called, you don't look them in the eye. Nora didn't care who was sitting there. She just wanted to clock out, catch the 2:45 a.m. bus, and go back to her damp apartment where the radiator clanked like a dying animal. She kept her eyes on the swinging doors of the kitchen, calculating the exact number of steps it would take to reach sanctuary. 30 steps. 25, 20. Her right heel caught the edge of a poorly tacked Persian rug. It wasn't a dramatic trip. It was a subtle, fatal snag. The kind that shifts your center of gravity just enough to render you entirely helpless. Her ankle gave way. The tray tipped. Time slowed to a viscous crawl. Nora watched the heavy crystal tumblers slide toward the edge of the plastic tray. She reached out, a futile attempt to correct the disaster, but momentum had already won. She pitched forward. She braced for the jarring impact of the hardwood floor. She prepared for the shatter of glass, the sharp sting of shards, the humiliating wetness of stale alcohol soaking through her uniform. The crash happened. The glass shattered. But Nora didn't hit the floor. She crashed into something solid, something warm. The breath was knocked out of her lungs in a sharp gasp. The world spun, tilted, and then violently corrected itself. She blinked, her vision swimming in the dim, amber light of the club. Her hands were pressed flat against a charcoal-grey wool suit. Beneath the fabric, a chest rose and fell in a slow, infuriatingly calm rhythm. She had fallen directly into Booth 4. She was sitting in a man's lap. Silence dropped over the immediate vicinity like a heavy curtain. The ambient noise of the club, the bass-heavy music, the low murmur of voices, seemed to mute itself. Nora froze. Her brain misfired. She should stand up. She should apologize. She should scramble away and find Sullivan and beg for her job. Instead, her body betrayed her. She remained perfectly still, her hands resting against his chest, her thighs straddling one of his legs. The smell hit her first. Cedar, gun smoke, peppermint. It was an oddly clean scent for a place this dirty. She looked up. Dominic Rossi wasn't looking at the shattered glass on the floor. He wasn't looking at the amber liquid currently soaking into the cuff of his bespoke trousers. He was looking at her. His eyes were the color of slate just before a storm. Cold, unreadable, and terrifyingly still. He had the kind of face that belonged on a Roman coin, all sharp angles and unforgiving lines. His jaw was clenched, a muscle feathering just beneath the skin. Nora opened her mouth. Her throat was bone dry. She tried to push herself up. She planted her hands on his shoulders to leverage her weight backward. A large, heavy hand clamped down on her left hip. The grip was iron. It wasn't violent, but it was absolute. He didn't squeeze, but the weight of his fingers pressing into her skin through the thin fabric of her uniform sent a shockwave of cold panic straight down her spine. He didn't let her stand. "Don't move," he said. His voice was a low, rough rumble. It vibrated against her palms, where they still rested on his chest. It wasn't a request. It was an architectural fact. She was now part of the furniture. Nora's breathing turned shallow. She sat frozen on his lap, hyper-aware of every point of contact. The heat radiating from him, the rough texture of his suit jacket, the heavy gold ring on his right hand, currently resting on the table. Two large men in dark suits stepped out of the shadows behind the booth. They moved with the silent, predatory grace of wolves. One of them reached inside his jacket. Dominic didn't even look at them. He just raised 2 fingers on his right hand. The men stopped. They retreated a half step into the dark, but their eyes remained locked on Nora. "Mr. Rossi," Sullivan, the manager, materialized out of the gloom. He was practically vibrating with terror. His face was flushed, and a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He looked at the shattered glass, the spilled whiskey, and then at Nora, who was still pinned to Dominic Rossi's lap. "Mr. Rossi, I am so deeply sorry," Sullivan stammered, wringing his hands. "This is entirely unacceptable. The girl is clumsy. She's new. She's fired. I'll comp your table for the rest of the month. I'll have this cleaned up immediately." Sullivan reached out, grabbing Nora's upper arm to yank her away. Dominic's eyes flicked to Sullivan. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Take your hand off her," Dominic said softly. Sullivan snatched his hand back as if he had touched a hot stove. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. Of course, sir, I want to get this mess cleaned up for you." "The mess is fine," Dominic replied, his gaze returning to Nora. He studied her face. He catalogued the dark circles under her eyes, the slight tremble in her lower lip, the fierce, defiant flush creeping up her neck. He liked the defiance. He could see the absolute terror in her posture, but she wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She was just sitting there, waiting for the axe to fall. Nora tried to shift her weight. The hand on her hip tightened fractionally. A warning. "You ruined my suit," Dominic stated. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. "I tripped," Nora said. Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to meet his slate-grey eyes. "The rug is torn. The rug is torn," Dominic repeated, rolling the words around as if tasting them. He looked at Sullivan. "The rug is torn, Sullivan. I'll have it replaced tomorrow, Mr. Rossi. Tonight. I'll tear it up tonight." "See that you do." Dominic turned his attention back to Nora. His hand slowly, deliberately, slid from her hip. "Stand up." Nora didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled backward, her heels slipping slightly on the alcohol-slick floor. She caught her balance, smoothing down her skirt with trembling hands. Her knees felt like water. Dominic picked up a napkin from the table and casually dabbed at the wet spot on his trousers. He didn't look angry. He looked bored, but the air around him hummed with lethal tension. "Go to the back, Nora," Sullivan hissed, his face purple. "Get your things. You're done." Nora didn't argue. There was no point. You didn't spill whiskey on the head of the Rossi family and keep your minimum wage job. She gave one last look at the man sitting in the booth. Dominic was watching her walk away. He didn't blink. He just watched. The alley behind the Cobalt Lounge smelled of rotting cabbage and stale beer. Nora pushed through the heavy metal exit door, pulling her thin wool coat tight against the biting autumn wind. 2 a.m. She had missed the bus. She stood under the flickering yellow light of the back entrance, digging through her purse for a cigarette she knew wasn't there. She had quit 3 months ago to save money. Tonight, she would have paid $20 for a single drag. Fired. She let out a dry, bitter laugh that turned into a cough. Her rent was due in 4 days. She had $80 in her checking account and half a box of stale cereal in her pantry. The math didn't work. It hadn't worked for a long time. She started walking. The streets were dead quiet, washed in the orange glow of sodium street lamps. The cold bit through her thin tights, numbing her aching legs. She wrapped her arms around herself, keeping her head down, calculating how many shifts she could pick up at the diner across town if she begged the owner. A low rumble broke the silence of the street. Nora glanced over her shoulder. A black SUV, sleek and heavily tinted, was crawling down the street behind her. It matched her pace. Her stomach dropped. She walked faster. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement. The SUV accelerated, the engine purring like a large, mechanical beast. Nora turned a corner onto a narrower side street, hoping the car wouldn't follow. It did. She stopped under a street lamp and turned around, her heart hammering against her ribs. Running was pointless. If they wanted her, they would get her. The SUV pulled up to the curb and stopped. The engine idled smoothly. For 10 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then the rear passenger window rolled down with a soft, mechanical hum. A man leaned forward into the frame of the window. It wasn't Dominic. It was one of the wolves from the club, the one who had reached for his jacket. He had a scarred eyebrow and a broken nose that had healed crooked. "Nora Hayes," he said. His voice was gravelly, devoid of any inflection. "What do you want?" Nora demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. She jammed her hands deep into her coat pockets so he wouldn't see them shaking. "Mr. Rossi sent me." "I figured." Nora swallowed hard. "Look, I don't have any money. If this is about the suit, I can't pay for it. You can break my legs, but it won't buy him a new pair of pants." The man blinked. He didn't smile, but a shadow of amusement crossed his features. "Get in the car." "No." The man sighed, a heavy, tired sound. He opened the door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. He was massive, easily 6'4", broad across the shoulders. He didn't pull a weapon. He just stood there, blocking her path down the street. "Mr. Rossi is a businessman, Miss Hayes. He likes his ledgers balanced. You owe him a debt. He wants to discuss the terms of repayment. You can get in the car and we can have a civilized conversation, or I can put you in the trunk. I get paid the same either way." Nora looked down the empty, dark street. There was no one coming. No police cruiser, no late-night taxi. Just the cold wind and a man who could snap her neck with one hand. Survival instinct was a funny thing. It bypassed logic and dignity. Nora walked over to the open door and climbed into the back seat. The leather was soft and smelled heavily of new car chemicals and faint cologne. The door slammed shut behind her, plunging her into the tinted darkness. The large man got into the front passenger seat. The driver, completely silent, put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb. They drove in silence for 20 minutes. Nora stared out the window, watching the familiar, gritty streets of her neighborhood give way to the sleek, manicured roads of the city's wealthiest district. They passed through a set of heavy iron gates that swung open silently at their approach. The driveway was long and lined with ancient oak trees. At the end of it sat a sprawling 3-story stone mansion. It looked like a fortress. The car stopped at the front steps. The large man got out and opened Nora's door. "Inside." Nora stepped out. The air here felt different. cleaner, colder. She followed the man up the stone steps and through massive double doors. The foyer was vast, floored in stark black and white marble. A crystal chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a brilliant, cold light. It was beautiful, but it felt hollow, like a museum. "Wait here," the man said, pointing to a rigid, high-backed wooden chair near a sweeping staircase. Nora sat. She didn't take off her coat. She sat on the very edge of the chair, her knees pressed tightly together, listening to the heavy silence of the house. 10 minutes passed, then 20. It was a tactic. She knew it. Make her wait. Let the anxiety curdle in her stomach until she was pliable and panicked. Footsteps echoed on the marble floor from a hallway to her left. Dominic Rossi walked into the foyer. He had changed out of the ruined suit. He was wearing dark slacks and a black fitted dress shirt, the top 2 buttons undone, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He looked less like a mafia boss and more like a tired, dangerous insomniac. He was holding a crystal glass with an inch of amber liquid in it. He stopped a few feet away from her, taking a sip from his glass. He didn't speak immediately. He just looked at her, subjecting her to that same intense, paralyzing scrutiny he had used in the club. Nora met his gaze. She was terrified, but she was also incredibly profoundly tired. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a brittle exhaustion. "You ruin a bespoke Brioni suit," Dominic said quietly, his voice echoing slightly in the vast room. "And then you refuse to get in the car when my man politely asks you to." "He threatened to put me in the trunk," Nora replied flatly. The corner of Dominic's mouth twitched. It was almost a smile, but it died before it reached his eyes. "Matteo lacks tact," I told him. "And I'll tell you," Nora said, standing up. The chair squeaked slightly against the marble. "I don't have your money. I have $80 to my name. I just lost my job. So, if you brought me here to kill me over dry cleaning, get it over with. I'm tired." Dominic walked slowly toward her. He stopped when he was close enough that she could smell the cedar and peppermint again. He looked down at her. Up close, the lines of exhaustion around his eyes were more prominent. He looked like a man who carried a mountain on his shoulders and refused to acknowledge the weight. "I don't kill people over dry cleaning, Nora." The way he said her name, a low, intimate rumble, sent a shiver down her arms. "Then what do you want?" "You owe me a debt," Dominic stated, taking another sip of his drink. "The suit cost $5,000. The spilled whiskey was a 25-year-old Macallan. Let's call it a flat 6,000. Nora laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Right. I'll write you a check right now. Just let me find my solid gold pen." Dominic didn't react to her sarcasm. He merely reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and held it out to her. Nora hesitated, then took it. It was a standard employee contract. "You need a job," Dominic said. "I need someone to manage the absolute chaos of my front office. My previous assistant had a habit of asking questions that didn't concern him. He is no longer employed here." Nora stared at the contract. The salary printed on the second page was 3 times what she made at the Cobalt Lounge in a year. "You want me to be your secretary?" "Executive assistant," Dominic corrected. "You will answer the phones, manage my schedule, pour my coffee, and keep the riffraff out of my study. In exchange, I will deduct a portion of your salary until your debt is paid. Once the 6,000 is cleared, you can walk away, or you can stay. That will be your choice." Nora looked from the paper to his face. It was a trap. She knew it. The devil doesn't offer you a job with dental benefits out of the goodness of his heart. "Why me?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. "You could hire anyone, someone with actual experience. I'm a waitress who can't even carry a tray without falling over." Dominic looked at her for a long, silent moment. His eyes dropped briefly to her lips, then snapped back up to her eyes. "Because when you landed in my lap tonight," Dominic said, his voice dropping an octave, "you were terrified, but you didn't flinch, you didn't beg, and when Sullivan tried to grab you, you looked ready to take his eye out." He took a half step closer. Nora held her ground, refusing to back away. "I don't need competence, Nora. I can teach competence. I need someone who doesn't shatter when the pressure drops." He reached out, his knuckles brushing lightly against the sleeve of her cheap coat. "You sign the paper, you work off the debt. You refuse, and Matteo drives you back to your cold apartment, and we never speak again." It was a lie. If she walked out that door, she would always be looking over her shoulder. But if she stayed, she was willingly stepping into the cage. Nora looked at the staggering numbers on the page. She thought about her empty fridge, the clanking radiator, the relentless, grinding anxiety of poverty. Where do I sign? The reality of working for a syndicate boss was profoundly boring for the first 3 days, and then violently terrifying on the fourth. Nora's desk sat in an antechamber, just outside Dominic's main study on the ground floor of the mansion. The desk was heavy mahogany, immaculate, and equipped with a multi-line phone that rarely rang. Her duties initially were domestic to the point of absurdity. She brewed espresso. She sorted his mail into 3 piles: bills, business, and throw away without opening. She booked flights under fake names for men with broken noses. Dominic was a ghost. She saw him in the mornings when she brought him his coffee. He would be sitting behind his massive desk, already dressed in a sharp suit, reading reports. He rarely spoke to her beyond a curt nod or a brief instruction, but she could feel him watching her. Whenever she turned her back to leave the room, she felt the heavy, tactile weight of his stare tracking her movements. It was maddening. He had brought her here under a flimsy pretense of a debt, placed her right outside his door, and then proceeded to ignore her. Until Thursday. It was raining heavily, the sky outside the tall windows a bruised, angry purple. Nora was organizing a stack of invoices when the heavy oak doors of the study burst open. Matteo strode out, dragging a man by the collar of his shirt. The man was young, maybe 25, wearing a cheap suit that was currently stained with dark, wet patches. He was sobbing loudly, his face bruised and swollen, blood leaking from a split lip. Nora froze, her hand hovering over a stapler. Her breath caught in her throat. Matteo didn't even look at her. He hauled the sobbing man across the antechamber. "Please," the young man choked out, his heels dragging on the expensive rug. "Tell him I'll get it. I just need 2 days. Please, man, you know I'm good for it." Matteo opened the outer doors and shoved the man into the hallway. "You have until tomorrow at noon, or we don't just take the car, we take the hands." The door slammed shut. Silence rushed back into the room, thick and suffocating. Nora sat completely still, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stared at the spot on the rug where a single drop of blood had fallen from the man's split lip. Show, don't tell. The reality of what Dominic Rossi did for a living had just been violently shoved in her face. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a monster who broke people for money. "Nora." The voice came from the open doorway of the study. Nora slowly turned her head. Dominic was leaning against the doorframe. He had taken off his suit jacket and unbuttoned his collar. His sleeves were rolled up. He held a lit cigarette between his fingers, the smoke curling upward in lazy spirals. He wasn't looking at the blood on the rug. He was watching her, gauging her reaction, testing her. This was the trap. This was why he hired her. He wanted to see if she would break, Nora swallowed the bile rising in her throat. She forced her hands to stop shaking. She picked up a tissue from her desk, stood up, walked over to the spot on the rug, and knelt down. She scrubbed at the drop of blood until it faded into the dark red pattern of the wool. She stood up, threw the tissue into the wastebasket, and turned to face him. Her face was a mask of perfect, icy calm. "Did you need something, Mr. Rossi?" she asked, her voice steady. Dominic's eyes darkened. He took a drag from his cigarette, exhaling the smoke slowly. He didn't speak for a long time. The silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. Finally, he pushed off the doorframe and walked toward her. He didn't stop until he was standing a foot away, invading her personal space. The smell of copper from the hallway mixed with the cedar of his cologne. "You don't ask what happened," Dominic said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "It's not in my job description," Nora replied. "You're not afraid?" Nora looked up into his slate-grey eyes. "I'm terrified, Mr. Rossi, but my debt is $6,000. I figure I have about 5,800 left to go. Until then, I mind my own business." Dominic stared at her. A muscle leaped in his jaw. Slowly, he reached out his right hand. He didn't touch her, but his fingers hovered inches from her cheek. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin. He could see the pulse jumping wildly in her throat, betraying her calm facade. "You are a very good liar, Nora," he murmured. "I'm a survivor. There's a difference." Dominic smiled. It was a terrifying, genuine smile that transformed his face, making him look young and devastatingly handsome. He let his hand drop to his side. "Bring me another coffee," he ordered, turning back toward his study. "Black, no sugar." "And Nora?" He paused in the doorway, looking back over his shoulder. "Yes?" "Cancel my afternoon meetings. We are going for a ride. I think it's time you saw exactly what you're working for." The door clicked shut behind him. Nora stood alone in the antechamber, the silence pressing down on her again. She had passed the test, but as she walked toward the small kitchen to brew the coffee, she realized the horrifying truth. Passing the test meant she was now truly in, and the cage door had just locked behind her. The black SUV smelled of ozone and expensive leather. Nora sat in the back, her cheap wool coat pulled tight over her knees, staring out the tinted window. Dominic sat beside her. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't review any files. He just watched the city roll past, his profile sharp against the passing streetlights. They drove for 40 minutes, leaving the manicured wealth of the Rossi estate behind. The city decayed as they moved east. Glass high-rises gave way to brick tenements, and eventually to the sprawling, rusted skeleton of the shipping docks. The air here tasted of salt and diesel fuel. Matteo parked the SUV near a massive corrugated metal warehouse. The rain had stopped, leaving the cracked asphalt slick and black. "Out," Dominic said. Nora stepped into the biting wind. The docks were a city unto themselves, a labyrinth of stacked shipping containers and towering cranes. It was loud, the mechanical groan of heavy machinery mixed with the shouts of dock workers. Dominic didn't wait for her. He walked toward the warehouse, his stride long and purposeful. The men standing around the loading bays, rough men with calloused hands and hard eyes, stopped working as he approached. The silence rippled outward, shutting down the noise of the yard like a switch had been flipped. Nora followed close behind him, acutely aware of the eyes on her. Inside the warehouse, the smell of damp cardboard and machine oil was overpowering. A man in a high-visibility vest was waiting near a makeshift office built from chain-link fencing. He was sweating despite the cold. "Mr. Rossi," the man said, wiping his hands on a greasy rag, "we weren't expecting you." "That's the point of an audit, Frank," Dominic replied smoothly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The acoustics of the massive space seemed to bend around him, carrying his words with terrifying clarity. Dominic spent the next hour walking the floor. He didn't break any fingers. He didn't threaten anyone with a trunk. He asked questions. He looked at manifest logs. He checked the seals on specific cargo containers arriving from overseas. Nora walked a half step behind him with a clipboard. She wrote down numbers, container IDs, and shipping schedules as he dictated them. It was boring, it was bureaucratic, and it was deeply unsettling. She watched Frank's face as Dominic pointed out a discrepancy in a logging sheet. Frank looked like he was about to vomit. The fear wasn't the immediate, violent terror of the kid in the hallway. It was heavier. It was the fear of a man realizing his livelihood, his family, and his oxygen supply were entirely controlled by the man standing in front of him. Dominic wasn't a street thug. He was a system. He was the architecture of control. They walked back to the SUV as the sun began to set, casting long, bleeding shadows across the asphalt. "Why did you bring me here?" Nora asked, as Matteo pulled the car back onto the highway. Dominic turned his head, resting his temple against the leather headrest. He looked tired. The slate-grey eyes studied her face, mapping the exhaustion around her mouth. "If you're going to manage my books, you need to understand the currency," he said. "People think the business is about violence. Violence is just a tax we pay when communication breaks down. The business is logistics, it's leverage." "And Frank?" "Frank skimmed 4% off the top of the electronics shipment last month." Nora tightened her grip on the clipboard. "What happens to him?" "He pays it back with a penalty, and he never sleeps soundly again because he knows I know." Dominic turned his gaze back to the window. "I don't need to break his legs, Nora. I just need to own his peace of mind." Nora looked at the man beside her. He was a monster, but he was a rational one. That somehow made him vastly more dangerous. By week 3, Nora had memorized the rhythm of the house. The morning was for the legitimate fronts, the real estate holdings, the sanitation contracts, the restaurant groups. The afternoon was for the shadows. Men with thick necks and quiet voices came and went through the side door of the study. Nora's debt had dropped to $4,200. She kept a running tally in a small notebook in her purse. Every day she survived was a day closer to walking out the heavy iron gates. It was past midnight on a Thursday. The house was dead quiet. Matteo and the rest of the security detail were outside or in the east wing. Nora was sitting at her desk, rubbing her aching eyes, staring at a spreadsheet that refused to balance. The heavy oak doors of the study pulled open. Dominic stood there, holding a crystal tumbler of scotch. He had stripped off his tie and suit jacket hours ago. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up. "You're still here," he noted. "The Cayman accounts are a mess," Nora said flatly, not looking up from the monitor. "Whoever did this before me used a filing system based entirely on vibes and guesswork." Dominic took a slow sip of his drink. He walked out of the study and came around the side of her desk. He leaned a hip against the heavy mahogany, looking down at the screen. Up close, he smelled of the scotch and the faint, bitter tang of tobacco. "Leave it," he said. "I can find the missing 40,000 if I just track the wire transfers from—" "I said leave it, Nora." She stopped typing. She slowly took her hands off the keyboard and looked up at him. His face was unreadable, but there was a tightness around his eyes. "Come inside," he ordered, pushing off the desk and walking back into his study. Nora debated grabbing her purse and making a run for the front door. Survival instinct vetoed the idea. She stood up, smoothed her cheap skirt, and followed him into the lion's den. The study was cavernous, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that actually contained books, not just hollow props. A fire crackled low in the massive stone hearth. There was a small round table set near the window overlooking the dark gardens. On it sat 2 covered silver cloches, a bottle of red wine, and 2 glasses. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair. "I'm not hungry." Dominic pulled out a chair, sat down, and poured a heavy measure of wine into one of the glasses. "I didn't ask if you were hungry. You've been staring at a screen for 14 hours. You look like a stiff breeze would snap you in half. Sit down and eat." Nora bristled at the command, but her stomach betrayed her with an audible, embarrassing growl. She hadn't eaten since a dry bagel at 7 that morning. She walked over and sat stiffly on the edge of the velvet chair. Dominic reached over and lifted the cloches. Steam curled off thick cuts of rare steak, roasted asparagus, and potatoes dripping in butter. It smelled like heaven. It smelled like money. Nora picked up her fork. She didn't wait for him to start. She cut a piece of the steak and ate it. It was the best thing she had tasted in a year. Dominic didn't eat. He drank his wine and watched her. "You don't talk about your family," he said suddenly. Nora chewed, swallowed, and took a sip of water. "Nothing to talk about. My mother died when I was 16. My father walked out a year later. It's just me. No boyfriend, no attachments. Attachments are a liability when you're trying to make rent." She looked at him, her chin lifting defiantly. "Why do you care? As long as I pour the coffee and fix your ledgers, my personal life shouldn't matter." "Everything in this house is my business," Dominic replied softly. He reached across the table to pour her a glass of wine. As his arm extended, the cuff of his shirt pulled back. Nora saw it. A jagged, ugly silver scar wrapping around his forearm, thick and raised, disappearing under the white cotton. It wasn't a clean surgical line. It looked like the flesh had been torn. She stared at it. She couldn't help it. Dominic caught her gaze. He didn't pull his arm back. He set the bottle down and slowly turned his wrist, exposing the full length of the ruined tissue. "A knife," he said, answering the question she hadn't asked. "In Palermo, I was 19. I thought I was invincible. A man with a 6-inch blade taught me otherwise." He looked at her, his expression stripping away the untouchable boss and leaving only the man. "Everyone bleeds, Nora. The trick is making sure the other guy bleeds out first." He held her gaze for a long moment. The air in the room suddenly felt very thick, very hot. Nora realized with a jolt of panic that she wasn't just afraid of him anymore. She was fascinated by him. She abruptly pushed her chair back. The wood scraped harshly against the floor. "I should go. The buses stop running at 2. Dominic didn't move. "Matteo will drive you." "I prefer the bus." "Matteo will drive you," Dominic repeated, his voice dropping an octave, slipping back into the absolute authority of the boss. Nora turned and walked out of the study. She could feel his eyes on her spine the entire way down the hall. The dress came in a sleek black box delivered to Nora's desk on a Tuesday morning. There was no note. There didn't need to be. Dominic stepped out of his study 30 minutes later, buttoning a charcoal suit jacket. He looked at the unopened box, then at Nora. "We have a dinner tonight," he said. "The Gallo family, neutral ground at the Continental. You're coming with me to take notes and witness the agreement. Put that on." "I have clothes," Nora replied, her hands balling into fists in her lap. Dominic paused. He looked down at her faded cardigan and the skirt she had bought at a thrift store 3 years ago. His expression wasn't mocking. It was purely pragmatic. "Leo Gallo is a jackal," Dominic said evenly. "He looks for weakness. If you walk into that room looking like a secretary who counts pennies, he will treat you like one." If you walk in wearing $3,000 of Italian silk, he will treat you as an extension of my power. Put the dress on, Nora." It made sickening logical sense. Nora took the box into the downstairs guest bathroom. The dress was a deep midnight blue. It fit perfectly, too perfectly. It hugged her curves, falling to mid-calf, elegant but weaponized. It didn't make her feel beautiful. It made her feel like armor. When she stepped back out into the foyer, Dominic was waiting by the door. He turned. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. His slate eyes widened slightly, tracing the line of her neck down to her waist. He swallowed. Then the mask slammed back into place. "Let's go." The Continental was the kind of restaurant where menus didn't have prices, and the lighting was designed to hide sins. They were escorted to a private dining room in the back. Leo Gallo was already there. He was a man in his late 50s, heavily tanned, wearing too much cologne and a suit that was too bright. He had two massive bodyguards standing in the corners of the room. Matteo took up a position by the door. "Dominic," Leo spread his arms wide, a greasy smile plastered across his face. Sit, drink with me." Dominic pulled out a chair for Nora. It was a fluid, gentlemanly gesture that completely contrasted with the lethal tension in the room. He sat next to her. Leo's eyes immediately locked onto Nora. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her chest, then slowly dragged his gaze down the midnight blue silk. "And who is this?" Leo asked, licking his lips. "You didn't tell me you were bringing dessert, Dom." Nora felt a hot spike of humiliation in her chest. She kept her face blank, staring straight ahead, clutching her pen and notebook. Beside her, the temperature plummeted. Dominic didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He looked at Leo. "Her name is Miss Hayes," Dominic said. His voice was a soft, deadly purr. "She manages my accounts, and if you look at her like that again, Leo, I will personally carve your eyes out and feed them to the stray dogs behind this restaurant." The silence in the room was absolute. The two bodyguards in the corners shifted, their hands twitching toward their jackets. Matteo took a half step forward. Leo Gallo froze. The greasy smile melted off his face, replaced by a pale, twitching fear. He looked at Dominic, realizing instantly that it wasn't a threat. It was a promise. "Just a joke, Dom," Leo stammered, raising his hands in surrender. "Just a joke. No disrespect meant to the lady." "Then we understand each other," Dominic said, leaning back in his chair. "Let's talk about the trucking routes." The dinner proceeded. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Dominic dismantled Leo Gallo's demands piece by piece, offering nothing and taking everything. Nora took notes. Her hand was shaking slightly. Halfway through the main course, Dominic shifted in his chair. Beneath the heavy linen tablecloth, out of sight of everyone in the room, his large hand closed over her knee. Nora flinched. His grip was firm. The heavy gold ring pressed into her skin through the silk of the dress. It wasn't a sexual touch. It was an anchor. It was a physical manifestation of what had just happened. "You are mine. You are protected. You are under my shadow." Nora's breath hitched. She looked at him. Dominic was currently arguing shipping tariffs with Leo, his face a mask of cold boredom. But his thumb began to stroke a slow, deliberate rhythm against the side of her knee. She should pull away. She should slap his hand. She didn't. She let her leg rest against his, absorbing the heat radiating from him. The fear of Leo Gallo vanished, entirely eclipsed by the terrifying, suffocating realization of what it meant to belong to Dominic Rossi. She was no longer just paying off a debt. She had crossed a line in the ledger, and there was no math in the world that could calculate the cost of getting back out. Winter hit the city like a punishment. Ice coated the iron gates of the Rossi estate, and the sprawling gardens died under a blanket of grey frost. Nora's notebook was almost full. The tally in the bottom right corner of the final page read, 120 $120. One more week, one more paycheck, and the invisible tether binding her to the chair outside Dominic's study would dissolve. The thought didn't bring the profound relief she had expected. It brought a hollow, aching dread that she shoved down with black coffee and relentless focus. The dynamic between them had shifted since the dinner with Leo Gallo. It wasn't spoken of, it was lived. The heavy oak doors to the study remained open now when he was working. When he poured scotch at midnight, he poured 2 glasses. He didn't ask her about her family again, but he learned her. He noticed she chewed the plastic caps of cheap pens when she was stressed, so a heavy silver Mont Blanc appeared on her desk without a word. He noticed the draft from the foyer made her shiver, so a space heater was quietly plugged in beneath her feet. It was terrifying. Violence was easy to guard against. Care, from a man who dismantled lives for a living, was a weapon that bypassed all her defenses. It was a Tuesday at 2 a.m. The house was a tomb. Nora was compiling a quarterly risk assessment when she heard the heavy crunch of tires on the frozen gravel outside. Footsteps echoed in the foyer. Heavy, irregular. Nora stood up. Matteo walked in first, his overcoat stained with something dark and wet. He didn't look at her. He turned and helped Dominic through the doorway. Dominic's face was the color of ash. He was holding his left side, his arm pressed tight against his ribs. His dark suit jacket hid the damage, but the way he moved, stiff, favoring his right leg, his breathing shallow and ragged, told the entire story. "Get the doctor," Dominic grated out. His voice was raw, stripped of its usual smooth command. "Already called him," Matteo said, easing him toward the study. "He's 10 minutes out." Nora didn't panic. The frantic, clumsy waitress from the Cobalt Lounge was dead. She picked up a stack of clean towels from the hidden cabinet she had stocked weeks ago, grabbed the first aid kit, and followed them into the study. Dominic collapsed into the leather wingback chair by the fire. He let his head fall back, his eyes closing tight. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the freezing temperature outside. "Coat," Nora said. Matteo hesitated, looking at Dominic. "Do it," Dominic grunted. Matteo helped peel the heavy wool coat and the suit jacket off. The white dress shirt underneath was soaked through with a terrifying amount of blood. It painted his left side in a slick, dark crimson. "Knife or bullet?" Nora asked. Her voice was perfectly steady, even as her heart hammered violently against her ribs. "Graze," Dominic breathed out. "Bullet. Gallo's men got bowled at the docks." "Matteo, go wait for the doctor at the gate," Nora ordered. The large man looked at her, surprised by the authority in her tone, then nodded and left the room. Nora knelt beside the chair. She didn't ask for permission. She unbuttoned his shirt, her fingers slick with his blood, and pulled the fabric back. The wound was ugly, a deep, jagged gouge tearing across the muscle of his oblique. It wasn't fatal, but it was bleeding heavily. She folded a towel into a thick square and pressed it hard against the wound. Dominic flinched, a sharp hiss escaping his teeth. His right hand shot out and gripped her wrist like a vice. "Keep breathing," she said softly. She didn't pull away from his grip. She just leaned her weight into the towel, applying pressure. He opened his eyes. They were dilated, dark with pain, but they locked onto hers with absolute focus. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the crackle of the fire and the ragged pull of his breathing. They were inches apart, She could smell the iron of the blood, the cold winter air clinging to his skin, the faint scent of gunpowder. "You're not shaking," he whispered, his thumb lightly stroking the inside of her pulse point where he held her wrist. "I'm keeping the blood inside your body, Dominic. Panicking wouldn't help." It was the first time she had used his first name. The muscle in his jaw feathered. He let go of her wrist and instead moved his hand to the back of her neck, his large fingers tangling in the hair at the nape. He didn't pull her closer. He just held her there, anchoring himself to her. "The debt is cleared, Nora," he said quietly. Nora froze. The pressure of her hands on the towel didn't waver, but her lungs stopped working. "I still owe 120. Consider it hazard pay." His voice dropped, rough and exhausted. "You're done. The ledger is clean." He was setting her free. He was doing it now, while he was bleeding, while his defenses were entirely stripped away. "I can't leave until the doctor gets here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That's not what I mean, and you know it." His thumb traced the line of her jaw. It was a gentle, devastating touch. "If you walk out the front door tomorrow, I won't stop you. Nobody will follow you. You get your life back." Nora looked down at the blood soaking through the white towel. She looked at the man who owned the city, currently bleeding in a chair, trusting her with his life. "And if I stay?" she asked. Dominic's eyes darkened, the slate turning to absolute black. The air between them turned electric, heavy with a promise that had nothing to do with contracts or debts. "If you stay," he murmured, his thumb brushing over her lower lip, "you never get to leave again. You understand me? If you choose this, if you choose me, the cage locks from the inside." Headlights flashed across the window. The doctor had arrived. Dominic's hand dropped from her neck. The moment shattered. Nora stood up, her hands stained red. She backed away as the doctor rushed into the room. She walked to the guest bathroom, turned on the faucet, and watched the blood wash down the drain. The water ran pink, then clear. She stared at her pale face in the mirror. The ledger was clean. She was free. She had never felt more trapped. Nora packed her bag on Friday morning. It didn't take long. She had only brought 3 sweaters, a few skirts, and the midnight blue silk dress she had folded carefully at the bottom of the canvas duffel. She walked into the foyer. The house was quiet. Dominic was in his study, the doors closed. He knew she was leaving. He had transferred a severance package into her account that morning. $10,000, clean money, a goodbye. She stood outside the heavy oak doors for a full minute. She raised her hand to knock. She let it fall. There was nothing left to say. The contract was fulfilled. She walked out the front doors, down the frozen gravel driveway, and out the iron gates. She took a cab back to her neighborhood. The apartment smelled of damp plaster and old dust. The radiator clanked, a familiar, depressing rhythm. Nora unpacked her bag. She bought groceries. She paid her rent 6 months in advance. She was safe. By Tuesday, she felt like she was losing her mind. The silence of her apartment was deafening. There were no multi-line phones ringing. There were no manifests to check. There was no heavy, cedar-scented presence watching her from a doorway. She got her job back at the diner. The manager, a tired woman named Patty, took her back on the breakfast shift. Nora poured cheap coffee. She wiped down sticky laminate tables. She smiled at truck drivers and construction workers, but her hands felt empty. Her brain, conditioned to process millions of dollars in offshore accounts and track international shipping routes, felt like a high-performance engine idling in a traffic jam. She caught herself looking at the door every time the bell chimed. She caught herself checking the dark corners of the street when she walked home, looking for a black SUV that wasn't there. She had survived the underworld, but the normal world now felt like a photograph that had faded in the sun. It was flat, colorless. 3 weeks passed. It was a rainy Thursday night. The diner was empty except for a trucker in the back booth and Nora, who was rolling silverware into paper napkins behind the counter. The bell above the door chimed. Nora didn't look up immediately. "Take any seat, I'll be right with you." Heavy footsteps crossed the linoleum. Not one person, 3. The hairs on the back of Nora's neck stood up. The rhythm of their steps was wrong, too deliberate. She looked up. 3 men stood in the aisle. They were wearing heavy coats, water dripping from the hems onto the floor. They weren't Dominic's men. She didn't recognize them, but she recognized the posture, the casual arrogance of men who carried violence in their pockets. The man in the center smiled. He had a gold tooth and a jagged scar across his chin. "Nora Hayes," he said. It wasn't a question. Nora slowly set the silverware down. She slid her hand under the counter, her fingers brushing the handle of the panic button Patty had installed after a robbery 2 years ago. "Kitchen is closed," Nora said, her voice perfectly flat. "Coffee only." "We ain't here for coffee, sweetheart," the scarred man said, taking a step closer. "Leo Gallo sends his regards. He heard Rossi's little pet bird flew the coop. Thought you might want to come answer some questions about his ledgers, since you know where all the bodies are buried." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. She had thought she was out. She had thought leaving the mansion meant leaving the war. She was an idiot. Dominic had told her. The business was about leverage, and a former assistant with a head full of account numbers was the ultimate leverage. "I don't know anything," Nora said. She pressed the panic button, a silent alarm. The police would take 10 minutes to get here. She had 30 seconds. "Don't lie to me, girl," the man snarled, lunging forward. He reached across the counter, his large hand grabbing the collar of her uniform shirt. He yanked her forward. Nora didn't scream. The instincts honed in the Rossi estate kicked in. She didn't pull back. She went with the momentum, grabbing the heavy glass carafe of boiling coffee from the burner. As the man pulled her chest against the counter, she swung the carafe hard, smashing it directly against the side of his head. The glass shattered. Boiling coffee and blood exploded outward. The man screamed, dropping her and staggering back, clawing at his scalded face. The other 2 men froze in shock for a fraction of a second. Nora bolted. She didn't run for the back door. They would expect that. She vaulted over the counter, slipping on the spilled coffee, and scrambled towards the front entrance. She made it to the door, pushing it open against the wind and rain. A hand caught her hair. The grip was brutal, jerking her backward so hard her feet left the ground. She hit the floor hard, the breath knocking out of her lungs. One of the men loomed over her, his face twisted in rage. He pulled a heavy black pistol from his coat. "Bitch," he spat, racking the slide. The glass of the diner's front window abruptly exploded inward. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, echoing off the tile walls. The man standing over Nora stiffened. A neat, dark hole appeared in his forehead. His eyes rolled back, and he collapsed backward like a marionette with its strings cut. Nora scrambled away from the body, her ears ringing, glass raining down around her. Through the shattered window, a black SUV sat idling at the curb. The front doors of the diner swung open. Matteo stepped in first, his weapon drawn, sweeping the room. He didn't even look at the dead man. He pointed his gun at the scarred man who was still writhing on the floor, bleeding and burned. Then Dominic walked in. He was wearing a black overcoat over a dark suit. The rain caught in his hair. His face was a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. It was the face of the monster, the machine. He walked past the body on the floor. He didn't look at the scarred man Matteo was holding at gunpoint. He walked directly to Nora. She was sitting on the floor, surrounded by shattered glass and blood, shaking violently. Dominic knelt down in the mess. He ignored the ruin of his expensive trousers. He reached out and gently, incredibly gently, pulled a piece of broken glass from her hair. "Are you hurt?" His voice was a low rumble, barely audible over the ringing in her ears. Nora shook her head. She couldn't speak. Dominic looked at her neck where the man had grabbed her uniform. A red mark was already forming. His slate eyes darkened to pitch. He stood up. He turned to the scarred man held by Matteo. "Tell Leo," Dominic said, his voice carrying the weight of a death sentence, "that his debt is no longer financial. I am coming for his breathing." Dominic looked at Matteo. "Clean this up." He turned back to Nora. He didn't ask her if she wanted to come. He didn't offer her a choice. He leaned down, hooked his arm under her knees and behind her back, and lifted her off the floor. He carried her out of the diner, into the freezing rain, and placed her in the back of the SUV. He slid in beside her. The door slammed shut, plunging them into the warm, leather-scented darkness. The car peeled away from the curb. Nora sat shivering, the adrenaline crashing out of her system, leaving her hollow and exhausted. She looked at the man beside her. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw locked tight, a muscle feathering violently. He was furious, not at her, at the fact that the world had dared to touch something that belonged to him. "I gave you an out," Dominic said softly to the window. "I let you walk away. I broke my own rules for you, and they almost killed you for it." He finally turned to look at her. The mask was gone. There was a raw, possessive hunger in his eyes that terrified her and thrilled her in equal measure. "You're not safe out here, Nora. You're never going to be safe in the grey world again. You know too much. You belong to the dark now." He reached across the seat and grabbed her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. His grip was an iron cage. "I'm not letting you go again. The contract is void. You belong with me. Fight it if you want. Hate me if you need to. But you are not leaving my sight." Nora looked at their joined hands, the heavy gold ring pressed against her knuckles. She thought about the quiet, agonizing boredom of her safe apartment. She thought about the hollow feeling in her chest for the last 3 weeks. She had tried to go back to the light, but it burned her eyes. The dark was where she made sense. She didn't pull her hand away. She turned her body toward him, the leather seat creaking softly. She looked up into his slate-grey eyes. The fear was gone. What remained was a cold, absolute clarity. "I'm not fighting it," Nora said. Her voice didn't shake. "But I'm not a prisoner, Dominic. If I go back, I don't sit in the antechamber anymore. I don't just pour the coffee." Dominic's eyes widened slightly, the surprise cracking through his rigid anger. "I know the ledgers," she continued, her voice hardening. "I know Gallo's distribution routes better than he does. You're going to war with him. You need a quartermaster. You need a partner." She squeezed his hand back, her small fingers gripping his with surprising strength. "I didn't fall back into your lap tonight, Dominic. I walked into the car. But if I stay, I stand beside you." Dominic stared at her. The silence in the car stretched, heavy with the weight of her demand. Slowly, the anger in his face melted away, replaced by something far more dangerous. Pride, and a dark, consuming affection. He lifted their joined hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles. It wasn't a gentleman's kiss. It was a seal on a new contract. "Beside me," he murmured against her skin. "Always." The SUV sped through the rain, leaving the decaying streets behind, driving back toward the fortress on the hill. Nora leaned her head against his shoulder, smelling the cedar, the gun smoke, and the peppermint. The machine was running again, but this time her hands were on the wheel. The line between captivity and choice is razor thin, and Nora just crossed it. She didn't just survive the Mafia boss, she demanded a seat at his table. But with Leo Gallo officially marking them for death, the real war is only just beginning. Can their new, dangerous partnership survive the bloody conflict ahead? Or will the underworld swallow them both? If you lived for this dark, high-stakes romance and want to see how they take down the Gallo family, you know what to do. Smash that like button, share this story with your friends, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next violent, gripping chapter. Drop a comment below. What's your favorite moment between Dominic and Nora? See you in the dark.